Welcome to today's presentation on understanding anisotropy, from well log analysis and correction to well ties and 3D anisotropic inversion. So during the course of today's presentation, I'm going to talk a little bit about the importance of anisotropy in the subsurface workflow, with a particular emphasis on VTI anisotropy, and I'll explain what that is in a few more slides' time. But first of all, why should you care about anisotropy? What is it? How can we identify and measure anisotropy? And where does it fit in the subsurface workflow? Once we've run through those slides, I'll show a few case studies using real-world data and examples that will hopefully help to drive home the message of why anisotropy is and can be so very important to the subsurface interpretation and characterization process. So why should you care about anisotropy? Well, from the perspective of amplitude screening, we're very often looking for evidence of direct hydrocarbon indicators. But in the presence of anisotropy, particularly in certain basins around the world, the impact of anisotropy is such that it can generate false positives. And there are plenty of examples of that in the literature. If you're performing depth to time calibration, have you thought about anisotropy, particularly if you're in a field development situation and we're working with multilaterals, long reach wells, where significant sections of the logs are required at significant inclinations? How about when we go to calibrate those wells to the seismic? Have you thought about the impact of anisotropy on the velocity measurements and the fact that it might impact the reflectivities that you calculate and the synthetics that are subsequently generated from those reflectivities? In seismic imaging, it's pretty routine these days that some form of anisotropy is incorporated, but where did those parameters come from? Are they reasonable for the area you're in? Could you do a better job of constraining them by deriving them from the data that you might have to hand from wells and from VSPs? In the reservoir characterization workflow, are we sure that the elastic properties that we've derived from the seismic are the correct properties to be used for classification? Can we leverage the anisotropy to understand something about fracture distributions, orientations, and presence? And from a field management perspective, if we're suffering from well integrity issues, perhaps we need to have a think about anisotropy. Are the data that we're using suffering from the impact of anisotropy? Can we update all of our models to incorporate that and actually come up with an improved understanding of where and how to drill and develop and produce a particular resource or asset? So what is velocity anisotropy? Well, one of my good colleagues came up with the well, it depends on how you look at it. And of course, that's exactly what anisotropy is. Anisotropy, or a medium, is anisotropic if, for a given fixed location, the elastic properties, Vp and Vs, vary depending on the measurement angle. There are two common expressions or two common types that we sort of refer to in geophysics. So that's the vertical transverse isotropy. So that would be the layered earth or laminations in a shale unit, and horizontal transverse isotropy, which would include things like fractured rocks. And we can get various combinations of these things that will give rise to different seismic responses. So the anisotropy can be described by 5 key parameters. That's the VP and VS in the direction of symmetry, and the corresponding Thompson parameters for that medium, epsilon, gamma, and delta. The Thompson parameters epsilon, gamma, and delta themselves are determined by 5 stiffnesses, and those stiffnesses are described in a variety of different directions relative to the symmetry axis of the medium that we're looking at. So you can see, for example, epsilon is primarily dependent on the vertical and the horizontal stiffness. Okay, so that's describing the sort of change, if you like, in the stiffness, or the change in the velocity. That's what it will equate to as you move from a wave in the vertical to the horizontal directions. And we can see that depending on the Thompson parameter of interest, we have a different mixture of either P wave, S wave, or a combination of the two that contribute to the anisotropic parameter. And those will modify the effective velocities and of course have an impact on the subsequent reflectivities that would be calculated from the combination of those velocities with the density information. Now, you know, VTI anisotropy is pretty ubiquitous. It's everywhere, and it impacts pretty much everything that we measure and interpret. So some might say, well, why bother? You know, if it's at location X, then it's also at location Y, so the results are comparable, and I probably don't need to worry about it. Well, to some degrees that may be true, but there are in fact some very good reasons and cases where it's not quite so plain and straightforward, and I'll illustrate that a little bit later. But one of the other issues is that, you know, if we think anisotropy is everywhere, then why are all of the algorithms that we're using isotropic? So the vast majority of synthetic modeling algorithms that you'll find in commercial software packages are isotropic. Gassman's fluid substitution technique assumes isotropic media, and the vast majority of commercially available inversion algorithms are also isotropic. So let's have a look at the way in which VTI anisotropy can impact the data that we're looking at throughout the subsurface workflow, and look at a couple of examples of how we might go about addressing that. So first up, how do we actually measure or even identify the presence of anisotropy in the data that we're working with? There's a variety of different ways, and they come from measurements, or we can create these measurements at a variety of different scales. So at the sort of coarsest scale, if you like, we might have seismic acquisition, and of course there would be a sort of vertical component of the move out, referred to as the eta parameter. So we can come up with some forms of estimates of anisotropy for the very broad layering of the Earth as seen when acquiring seismic. It might be that we have some walkaway VSP data, and so we could use that to look at the change in velocity or horizontal slowness as we move from the vertical to the horizontal, and that would allow us to come up with a rough estimate of the anisotropic parameters, which could then be used during synthetic modeling. Moving downscale again, we could go and look at the actual well log velocities themselves, which are typically acquired at a sort of 6-inch or so scale. And particularly in the cases where we have multiple wells, which are drilled perpendicular and sort of oblique to the layers that we're drilling through. So if we have a range of inclination angles through the same formation at the same sorts of depths, then effectively we can use that to fit a function through the data constrained to the anisotropic equations, such that we can estimate epsilon, gamma, and delta directly from the well logs themselves. And lastly, right down to the micro scale, we might have laboratory-based experiments that look at things like strain versus P-wave velocity for the different stiffnesses, and we could come up with a model that describes the degree of anisotropy for a particular sample at that particular scale. So all of these measurements could be combined into a scale-dependent model that you could then utilize in your seismic modeling studies, going right away from the core data scale all the way through to the sort of seismic scale up to the tens and hundreds of meters. So where does this all sort of fit into the subsurface workflow? Well, on the far left-hand side, we've got sort of the exploration end of the spectrum. So you have things like acquisition planning. So particularly if you're in an area with significant sort of tectonic stresses and you're looking for fractures, then you might want to do some HTI modeling to understand what orientation to perform a seismic shoot at to maximize your chance of being able to detect maybe open versus closed fractures. You might want to improve the imaging on the far offsets of a seismic data set. And so you want to move into an anisotropic processing sequence. Where do those anisotropic parameters come from? Well, ideally, they would be acquired from VSPs and other analogous information. If we're doing screening studies, if we're doing pore pressure prediction, then of course we should factor in the impact of anisotropy, build models with and without anisotropy, and understand what the impact might be. Similarly, for seismic well ties, if you're ever dealing with wells which have inclinations beyond 20 to 30 degrees or so, and that go through or that encounter significant shale sections through the reservoirs, then for sure you should be looking at anisotropy and factoring that into the calculation of the reflection contrasts, and so on and so forth, until we get down to the sort of production and field management, where again we start to think about the behavior of the subsurface properties of the rocks through production time, specifically thinking about wellbore stability, wellbore integrity, and the geomechanical behavior. And a lot of the models that we work with in this portion of the sort of workflow and life cycle are often based on isotropic models, and certainly based on having isotropic data as input to those models. So if we can improve the estimation of the properties and guarantee to some degree of accuracy that they are the isotropic properties that we want, then of course our model predictions will improve, and ultimately our management of the field will improve correspondingly. So let's look at a few examples of this in action. So here's a case study from the west of Shetlands, offshore the UK and Scotland. This is a basin that's been actively explored for several decades, and it's a basin that's well known for having had lots of amplitude anomalies that have been drilled and that have been unsuccessful. We conducted a study in 2011 that looked at a broad range of the exploration wells, vertical exploration wells across the entire basin. And we built up a model and understanding of the anisotropy of shales throughout one of the specific intervals. And we then used that and incorporated that into a series of simple half-space interface models, which we could then use to understand how the AVO response might change in the presence of these different types of anisotropy and for different reservoir seal configurations. So if we start in the deepest interval at 3,500 meters below the mudline, and we compare these class or the light blue and pink models at 35 and 3,000 meters below mudline, what we see is that the introduction of anisotropy, which are the solid lines, takes what was a class 4 AVO response for the isotropic case and flips the gradient in such a way that we would now interpret that as a class 3 AVO response. Now, the danger here is, of course, that with a small change in porosity, we have a brine-bearing sand with a class 3 response, which is very often interpreted to be a gas-bearing AVO type curve. Another complication in this basin is that there is differential uplift across the area. And so it wouldn't be untypical for a reservoir to have been buried to 2,500 meters, say, and then uplifted by 500 meters or sometimes well in excess of that. So at 2,500 meters, assuming an isotropic case, we'd have a fairly weak, almost transparent brine-bearing reservoir response. But with the incorporation of anisotropy, we actually end up with quite a strong class 2 reservoir. If we don't factor in uplift into our interpretation strategy for this region, and we're looking at a 2,000 meter burial depth prospect, and we ignore uplift, and we see a class 2 AVO response, the likelihood is we interpret that as a gas-bearing response. If we are unfortunately in an area where there has been moderate uplift, there's a significant chance that we could in fact just be looking at a brine-bearing response in the presence of anisotropy. So whilst it doesn't give you the answer, it does tell you that there is that there are other plausible explanations of that same amplitude response. Thinking about depth to time calibration, if we are in a situation where we have no check shot control, for example, very often we will find that people will apply integration to convert the velocity log into a time series, and that will then be used for the depth conversion. Now, if your well is inclined, such as it is in this case, out to 60 degrees, then there's a significant non-vertical component of that velocity. So when we use that to calculate the two-way time, and we compare it to the verticalized equivalent, we can see that we can actually end up with timing errors of the order of 150 milliseconds over a 1 to 1.5 kilometer section of mud rock. That's a significant timing difference, which will have significant implications on everything from time depth conversion through to wavelet estimation. Similarly, where we drill wells through these high inclined sections and we want to tie them then to the seismic, you'll very often find that they don't tie very well. And depending on the elastic property configuration of the cap rock and the reservoir rock or target rock, you can end up in situations where you have almost no well tie. So in this particular example, we performed the starting well tie using the measured logs, which gives us the synthetic, seismic and residual panel in the middle of the image on the right. And you can see at the top of the reservoir, there is simply no well tie. So we have significant uncertainty as to where to shift that well to tie it to the seismic, because we don't have check shots in these wells. it's not the norm to acquire check shots in appraisal and development wells. So what do? We have uncertainty. Well, we were able, given a handful of these wells, to estimate the anisotropic parameters and to then use those to correct the logs for the inclination of the well and for the volume of shale present through that interval. And after having gone through that process, we end up with the seismic well tie on the right-hand side. And now you can see that we have a pretty good well tie at the top of the reservoir, with the residuals being minimized accordingly. So it can really make the difference between a good and a poor well tie, and you could imagine what the implications might be for wavelet estimation. And the same is true not just of deviated wells, but of vertical wells in areas where you have significant anisotropy, because the seismic has a significant non-vertical component, which should be factored in to all of the synthetics that you create and use to do the well tie process. Thinking more to inversion, if we were to take lots of wells in an appraisal setting and use those wells to construct a low frequency background model, again, we can suffer from the impact of anisotropy. So I've posted the inclination of each of the wells from left to right across the 2D section that's shown on the right-hand side. And what we see is that where we have these high inclination wells in the target zone, which is dictated by the two red surfaces shown in the middle of the display, we see that the impedance moves from a blue to a green color. The impedance has increased where we have those wells. And the reason for that is on these two leftmost plots. So here's a simple plot of velocity versus density. So the density typically isn't impacted by anisotropy, velocity is. And colored by inclination, what we see is that we get an increase in velocity as the well inclination increases. Everything is at about the same sort of depth to within a few tens of meters. If we just look at the velocity versus inclination for that same interval, we see a significant increase in velocity, up to 25 to 30%. So what's happened is that we've incorporated logs that have anisotropy present and interpolated them into a model that we assumed to be isotropic. And of course, if we were to use that during an inversion process, we'll get the wrong results and we'll get the wrong estimation of rock properties. So there are some ways to tackle that. A lot of inversion algorithms are isotropic, but there have been solutions proposed to try to address that, sometimes through wavelet estimation and essentially fudging or factoring in to the wavelet scalars, but also through adjustment to what's referred to as pseudo-isotropic conditions. However, none of them get away from some of the fundamental problems of things like you still need to build a low frequency model. You have to be expert enough to actually construct the pseudo-isotropic logs. And the final properties that come out from the inversion are not actually the isotropic properties that are of interest. And so what we came up with is a method for incorporating anisotropic parameters into the facies types that are used throughout the inversion process. A couple of example slides. So here's a comparison of a synthetic seismic gather created with and without anisotropy incorporated. And as we compare the gather on the left to the gather on the right, we can see some sort of significant differences. Or we can make some observations, sorry. So firstly, there are almost no differences out to about 30 degrees. Beyond 30 degrees, we start to see some significant contributions from anisotropy, but typically those contributions are small, where beds are thin, and they get sort of proportionately larger with increasing bed thickness. Van Riel and de Bay proposed an adaptation to Ruger's anisotropic reflectivity model, whereby they modified it to be an isotropic equivalent, and they did that by modification of the underlying elastic properties. So alpha, G, and alpha over here. Through modification of those properties, they were able to show that they can effectively create a synthetic which is more or less identical to Ruger's formulation. So here we've got a comparison of the isotropic to the pseudo-isotropic logs and synthetics. Now, of course, at 0 degrees incidence, anisotropy has no effect. And so the acoustic impedance is identical between the two. But what we see is that in the shales, particularly in the clean shales, the pseudo-isotropic VPVS is significantly higher. And in the pseudo-density comparison, we see that the density in the clean formations is significantly lower. So we have in fact flipped the polarity of the density log relative to the reservoirs, which to any geologist would be highly counterintuitive. Using these different sets of input logs, we can calculate the synthetics and difference them, and the difference is shown on the far right hand track, and as I explained previously, they are almost 0. What we've then done is to perform a comparison of the inversion algorithms, firstly using isotropic inversion and isotropic wavelets. Then we created an anisotropic synthetic. We use isotropic inversion and isotropic wavelets. Then we use anisotropic input seismic, an isotropic inversion algorithm, but wavelets which have been scaled to account for the contribution of anisotropy. And then lastly, anisotropic seismic and pseudo-isotropic elastic properties. So for the isotropic case, we see that we get an almost perfect result, as you would expect. When we invert seismic data using an isotropic inversion and wavelets that have no accounting for the scaling impact, then we see that we get significant overshoot in the VPVS estimates, and we get density results which are almost polarity to what we're after. With some modification of the wavelets and their scalars, we can significantly improve the result using an isotropic inversion, but we still see areas of overshoot. And then lastly, using the pseudo-isotropic elastic properties example, we see that we get an almost perfect result, similar to the isotropic case. But of course, these are not the elastic properties that we want. Density is increasing into the reservoir relative to the background, which is the flip or the reverse of what any geologist would expect. So we have to now create pseudo-isotropic rock physics models to convert these back into properties that a regular interpreter could make some sense of. One way of actually handling this in a slightly more elegant manner is to incorporate anisotropy into the inversion workflow. And that can only be made possible through using a facies-based approach through which we assign anisotropic parameters to each of the different rock types. So what we're comparing here now is a classification of each of the different elastic property outputs from each of the different workflows. So here, the first or the second track in the image shows the truth case. So that's our isotropic inversion isotropic properties. The second oh, sorry, sorry. The truth case is just the facies derived from the log curves. Isotropic is the isotropic inversion of the isotropic synthetics. Then we have the isotropic inversion of the anisotropic synthetics. And of course, in this is not really a real world case, because you would always estimate wavelets, and in doing so, they're always going to have had some optimization based on the reflectivity model that you select. But what we see is that there is significant misclassification because of the overshoot in the elastic properties, because of the imbalance between the scalars in the isotropic model assumption. Now, after adjusting the wavelets, so this would be the equivalent to estimating wavelets from a data set that has anisotropy, but using isotropic reflectivities calculated from the elastic logs, we do a significantly better result and job, but there is still some misclassification. Now, unlike the previous version, where it would probably be quite obvious to anyone interpreting the data something is wrong, for this case, the fact that we have a single isolated oil sand is probably somewhat more enticing and plausible, and could lead to a poor drilling decision. In the last track, we have the result of anisotropic facies-based inversion. So when the inversion is run on this very last case, each facies has a corresponding anisotropy assigned. So if I'm a shale, then I belong to a VTI anisotropy model. But if I'm a sand, I'm isotropic. Depending on each of the samples and during the process of inversion, the algorithm switches between anisotropic and isotropic reflectivity models depending on the facies configuration. And in doing so, properly accounts for the contribution to the amplitudes from the VTI anisotropy, and as a consequence, the facies classification is improved and now is much more robust and accurate. Another example here from a North Sea field of the same comparison, but in this particular case, we're now thinking a little bit more about what's going to happen with these elastic properties when we hand them over to the next person down the line in the subsurface workflow. So here I have a comparison of isotropic and anisotropic inversion of corresponding isotropic and anisotropic inputs, followed by isotropic inversion of anisotropic inputs, which is shown in red. And what we see in this particular case is that it translates into a higher than expected velocity through the overburden sequence. So if we've derived properties using an isotropic approach and there's a significant anisotropic component to the seismic, and those properties are then used by others further down the workflow to estimate things like geomechanical properties, wellbore stability, pore pressure, then there is a significant risk that the predictions that those people will come up with will be incorrect and biased because of the inability of the algorithms to deal with the effects of anisotropy in the data. And this is an example from a North Sea well, where we do have a significant section drilled at high angle. So this is the same well that we looked at a little bit earlier. And the velocities are significantly higher through that zone because of anisotropy. Without any correction, if we invert the data for pore pressure through that zone using an Eaton type model, which was developed for that field, for that area, then what we end up with is an incorrect prediction. And of course, if that's being used for planning future well locations, or if it's being used to build a model and over that portion of the field, we're going to plan and drill more wells, then there's a significant risk that we may plan incorrectly and suffer whatever it may be, losses or stuck pipe or other issues that result in non-productive time. So to summarize, anisotropy is ubiquitous, it's present everywhere. There are all sorts of different ways that you can measure it, we can model it, we can incorporate it into the synthetics and subsurface analysis that we're performing, but ultimately icon signs provide a range of solutions that can be used to help to constrain and at least understand the impact of anisotropy throughout the subsurface. So to conclude, anisotropy impacts lots of the different data sets that we routinely work on throughout the E&P lifecycle. With the right data, you can estimate and you can understand the impact of anisotropy, and not only that, you can use it to actually improve the quality and reliability of your interpretations. So the key message really, don't ignore anisotropy, use it to your benefit. And with that, I would like to thank you for watching this presentation.